So this is a summary of U.S. History Chapter 7. We are done with the chapter. This is a summary of everything that we have covered. Please follow along with the numbers as we go. We started by talking about the stages of cooperation and gave examples about what that looked like in this time in history in the United States. Stage 1 was to gather together to discuss problems. That was before the end of the Revolutionary War, and they had the Albany Congress. And at the Albany Congress, they were unable to really start working together, so they disbanded without really getting anything done. For stage 2, they realized the need to start cooperating. So the different states engaged in occasional cooperation. For example, they boycotted British goods in the Stamp Act. In stage 3, they began to cooperate on a more regular, consistent basis, such as the Second Continental Congress, where they wrote the Articles of Confederacy, which they use to make rules and laws for a new, young United States nation after the Revolutionary War. But they didn't have legally binding cooperation until they got back together to write the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution would become law, and all of the states would need to agree to and follow those laws in stage 4, legally binding cooperation. Who was behind the new Constitution? Well, really, it was the wealthy business owners, because they realized that the United States has an economic problem, and the solution for that economic problem would be to have a stronger government. So they held this constitutional convention to write the U.S. Constitution in order to form a stronger government and a more perfect union. And that was how they were able to solve their economic problem. But they needed to make compromise. For example, there was no control on exports or slaves. That was a way that they could have the different states agree, specifically the North and the South. They also agreed to count slaves as 3/5, known as the 3/5 compromise, and that was a way to make sure that the number of people there was taxed appropriately, but also to make sure that the number of representatives in the House of Representatives was not disadvantageous or less good for the southern states, who had mostly slaves as their population. Also, they decided to have 2 houses in Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives, so that the large states couldn't completely control all of the decisions. It allowed the small states to also have an equal amount of control. Now, they had to also come up with a way to make sure that control was equal, so they formed the branches of government, and the 3 branches of government are the executive branch, the president, the Congress, and the Supreme Court, or the judiciary branch. And they formed also rules for checks and balances to make sure none of these 3 different branches had too much power. For example, the president was allowed to appoint judges and to veto laws. That gave him a check and a balance over the Supreme Court and Congress. The Congress has a check over the executive branch because they can override vetoes, but it also has an override or a check on the Supreme Court because they could impeach judges. The Supreme Court has a check because the president can't fire them. They serve for life. And the Supreme Court could nullify or say that the law is not constitutional and should not be followed if they don't agree with a law that Congress passes. After the checks and balances were established and everything was agreed upon, then it became necessary to ratify the Constitution, which meant that the public had to agree. And they went and did that in 3 different ways. They dominated by making it difficult for people who oppose the Constitution to vote, such as what they did in South Carolina. They debated, which meant they told their side and had people agree with them based on their opinions and trying to convince them that their opinion was right. And one of the most famous writings for debate was The Federalist, where a whole bunch of famous writers got together and wrote essays to help convince people why the U.S. Constitution was important. And then they would compromise. For example, they decided to include a Bill of Rights after the U.S. Constitution was ratified because a lot of the people who were opposed to the U.S. Constitution were afraid that it was not going to protect people's rights. And by compromising and saying that they would include a Bill of Rights, they were able to get more people to vote yes. That's a conclusion for Chapter 7. We are going to move on. We are going to do a quiz or an assessment now based on what you have learned. First, you are going to describe the first 3 stages of cooperation and give examples of each stage from the period of history before and during the Revolutionary War. Stage 1, gather and discuss, was the Stage 2, occasional cooperation, was the Stage 3, regular voluntary cooperation, was the Explain who was behind the Constitutional Convention and why they wanted a federal government. Give 2 examples of how a stronger federal government would help the wealthy business people. Number 4, problem was that voluntary cooperation could not solve the solution the wealthy business people wanted was a Number 6, the effect was the Number 7, an example was that a stronger federal government with a navy could Number 8, an example was that a stronger federal government with the power to tax could describe 3 problems in the Constitutional Convention and how compromise solved the problems. Number 9, representation for large and small states was solved by Number 10, whether to count slaves as population or property was solved by counting them. Number 11, control over trade was solved by giving Congress control over trade except for We're going to continue to assess your understanding of Chapter 7. Name and give an example of each of the 3 branches of the federal government and describe what each branch does. Number 12, the branch that carries out the laws and is headed by the president is the Number 13, the branch that passes the laws and includes Congress is the Number 14, the branch that interprets the laws and is headed by the Supreme Court is the For each branch of government, give an example of how its power checks or balances each of the other 2 branches of the government. Number 15, a power of the president over Congress is to Number 16, a power of the president over the Supreme Court is to Number 17, a power of Congress over the president is to Number 18, a power of Congress over the Supreme Court and the president is to Number 19, a power of the Supreme Court over the president is to Number 20, a power of the Supreme Court over the Congress is to Name the 3 political tactics used by the supporters of the Constitution to get the Constitution ratified and give an example of each. Number 21, domination by keeping the people against it from getting 22, debate, trying to convince people through arguments like those in 23, compromise, in offering a